Welcome back to another episode of the Makers Podcast. My guest on today's episode is Tony Wheeler, the co-founder of The Lonely Planet, which he started with his wife Maureen. The Lonely Planet is a publishing company which writes travel guidebooks for you travelers looking to explore the world. To date, they have sold over 120 million books, so I simply cannot wait to share his story with you. But just before we dive into today's episode, I would just like to say a massive thank you to Homegrown, the new entrepreneurs club based in Marylebone, which kindly let us film the interview with Tony recently. If you're interested in joining a scale-up entrepreneurs club that helps you meet new entrepreneurs, potential investors, and so many like-minded people, you can head over to their website, homegrownclub.co.uk. Tony is also coming to do a talk for us this July, so for more details, you can head over to makersseed.com, head over to the events page, and if you would like to attend, for a 30% discount, just enter coupon code Ollie and you'll get a 30% discount. We hope to see you there. Now, let's dive into today's episode. So Tony, welcome to the show. It's a glorious day. How are you doing today?
It's still going, which is remarkable in some ways, given that I think we're having our 45th anniversary at the moment, which is definitely a long time.
Wow, amazing. Well, before we get into the interview, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
What did I have for breakfast this morning? I had it far too early because I'm extremely jet-lagged at the moment, and I started with my usual breakfast of muesli.
And what is the one thing you would have done before you turned 20?
The one thing I should have done, or
should have done before you
one
turned 20?
thing I should have done. There are so. It's so easy after the event to say I should have bet on that horse, or I knew what was going to happen and I had my money on it. There are all sorts of things. My next lifetime, I'm going to come back and learn more languages.
Learn more languages, okay. And what is your favourite company right now, obviously apart from The Lonely Planet?
Oh, I hadn't even thought of this. It depends what I'm doing, I suppose, whether I'm getting my laptop fixed, in which case I'm very happy with Microsoft at the moment.
It's probably an airline, isn't it?
Well, airlines also come into it, and I must admit I fly Qantas at the moment, quite a lot.
So you co-founded The Lonely Planet in 1972 with your wife Maureen. How did the idea come about?
72, we were travelling. We travelled on what later became known as the Hippie Trail. I don't think we called it the Hippie Trail at the time. But we travelled, started out in London, ended up in Kathmandu, and then down through India, Southeast Asia, finally got to Australia. And we thought, someone should have written a book about that. It had been hard to find information, and in all sorts of ways, back in those days, this is obviously a long time ago, that information wasn't so readily available. Now, of course, you just turn on your phone or your laptop or your tablet and hit a few buttons and you have all the information you need immediately. But back then you couldn't even go into a bookshop and find that information. So we realized there was an information gap there and we set out to fill that gap.
And you did the journey in the Mini?
Yeah, we bought an old car in London and we set off driving east with the intention that the car was so cheap, if it had broken down, we'd have left it by the roadside. And in fact, it got us to Afghanistan, which was a good start, where we sold it for a small profit. And then we carried on by every means of public transport available. But it was initially, it was driving. And remarkably, I've done the sort of the same trip in the opposite direction in the last 12 months, because last year I drove from Bangkok to London, following the Silk Road on this occasion rather than the Hippie Trail.
And you did that journey in the MG, I believe?
That was an MG. You've definitely got all my facts here, haven't you?
I love classic cars. I have 4 classic cars myself.
Do you? We have to talk about that in a minute. We did it in old MGs. There was a sort of group of MG enthusiasts, and I was not an MG enthusiast, but I got talked into buying one in order to join this group.
Oh, interesting. And you did the original journey in the Mini, as we said, and you managed to have a $5 profit.
Yeah, $5 or £5. I don't think the currency mattered very much because it wasn't very much. And the funny thing is that sort of has resonated down the years, because Lonely Planet has quite a following in China now. And a few years ago, I got a call from BMW China saying, "We're launching the Mini in China. Can we bring you to China to help launch it?" you've got a following in this country. We know you drove a long way in a Mini many years ago. Come to China and try out the modern Mini.
Very interesting. Well, you met your wife Maureen in Regent's Park, not too far from here today, and I believe you were sitting on the opposite side of the park, and you went over to the bench and went to go and talk to her.
I was walking through through Regent's Park. I'd been in London about a week. I just started doing a MBA course at London Business School, and I walked through the park. It was an October afternoon, and there was still a little bit of sun around, and I sat down on this park bench, and 5 minutes later, this young lady came along and sat down on the other end of the bench, and probably something that's defined our life subsequently. I was reading a car magazine, having been an engineer for the previous years, and she sat down and started reading Tolstoy, and I picked her up. There it started.
And a year later, you got married.
Yeah, we did, and then the year after that, we started traveling, and that's basically been our story ever since.
So was that a good tax evasion, or for you keep bouncing
tax
from
evasion? I'm not sure. We didn't see it that way at all. We both enjoyed travel. We talked about it a lot. Even that first park bench meeting, we talked about travel amongst other things, and the idea of doing this. And it was an iconic trip at the time. The Beatles had just been in India with which Maharishi was it? They'd been in India there seeking enlightenment, or in George Harrison's case, seeking sitar music. The Marrakesh Express was on the record player. These names were sort of household names on the tip of your tongue. So people were thinking about more exotic regions than just going to Spain or whatever. And at the same time, lots of other things were happening. I was a baby boomer, so the boomers were finding their wings and starting to travel and going further than their parents had gone. The jumbo jets were just coming in, so you could fly further and cheaper, and all these elements came together.
And when you met Maureen, did you have a plan to travel around the world? Was it one country?
No, not at all.
What was the original idea?
When we met, we just met. It wasn't. We didn't start traveling. The following summer, we traveled around Europe. That was the first time we'd really traveled outside of England together. But yeah, we both. The idea of travel intrigued us both. Now, I'd travelled quite a lot already because my father was a BOAC before it became British Airways employee, and that took him around the world. And I moved from place to place and school to school when I was younger. So I had travelled a lot, but I've always said that you don't really travel until you travel by yourself, and that going on vacations with your parents isn't really the same as travel, which I think it's why gap years have such I'm not going to say an element of shock, but I know they do shock some people. They get out there for the first time and they suffer definite cultural shock. But gap years, are amazingly enlightening. I think young people who set out on a gap year trip, they probably learn more in that year than they did in their last 4 years of school and they would in the next 3 years of college or university. So I think gap years are great things, and I think that those first trips that you do by yourself do have a huge impact on you.
And so you left London with £400 when you and Maureen left. Weren't you nervous about running out of money?
£400 was a lot more in those days. It was far more than it is today. And yeah, of course we knew we were going to run out of money, I guess. And we got as far as Singapore, and the money was definitely running low by this time, even despite selling the car in Afghanistan. And I remember I couldn't send an email or a text message. They didn't exist. There was many years before they existed, and phone calls were difficult to make. I think I probably sent a telegram to my father and said, "Dad, I need some help. Can you send me 50 quid?" Which, being a good father, he didn't send me 100 quid. He did send me 50 quid. And that just barely got us to Australia with the little bit we had left at the time.
So how did you get from Singapore to Australia?
We first of all, there was a shipping service across from an island just south of Singapore to Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, a weekly ship. And we took that across to Indonesia, which we knew nothing about. Indonesia was a total blank in our knowledge at the time. We took trains and buses down through Java. We ended up in Bali. And in Bali, by this time, we really were running out of money, and we had just about enough to fly down to, not even as far as Melbourne or Sydney or one of the capitals, just to Darwin in the north of Australia. But then we bumped into a New Zealander with a yacht, and he said, I'm sailing down to Australia, I need a few more crew, and we were 2 more crew.
So at the right time, the right place.
Yeah, which I think does happen. You know, people who... I'm a great believer in the kindness of strangers and doors opening at the right moment, and it does seem very often in life that when you need a helping hands are there.
So you must have met some incredible people along your travels and journeys. Are there any people who really stick out to you?
Yeah, I've met lots of people, but you know, a lot of them have come and gone, as it were. You meet them and you travel with them for a while, and some of them stay friends for a while and then go off in their own direction. And you know, I've got a number who I could sort of think, well, I wouldn't mind seeing them again. I wonder where they are today. And some of them, of course, became Lonely Planet writers. One of the people we met on that very first trip. Later on, she lived in Hong Kong and worked as a journalist, and we talked her into writing a Hong Kong guide for us, purely because we knew she could write as a journalist, and she was in Hong Kong. That was her only qualifications for writing a guidebook. And we kept in touch with her for quite a few years. I'm sure I can find her today if I really needed to.
So talking about writing the books, how did the idea of the first book come about, and how long did it take?
When we left London, when, you know, that, as I was saying a few minutes ago, the information that you needed to travel wasn't readily. There wasn't a guidebook to the overland trip. There was a thing called the Bit Guide, and Bit was this wonderful 60s creation. It was based in Notting Hill, I think, when Notting Hill was a very different place from what it is today. Notting Hill was rather edgy in those days. And Bit was a sort of underground information centre that if you'd been busted for drugs and you needed a lawyer, or you had an unwanted pregnancy on your hands, or you just were somewhere, and we didn't have homeless on the streets in those days, but you needed a roof over your head. And Bit was the sort of connection for a lot of these things. And one of the ways that Bit made money was they sold these Bit guides, and they had an Africa one, a South America one, and an Asia one. And the Asia one was by far the best. And they were they were sort of social media of the era, that people wrote into Bit, you know, sent Bit postcards or letters suggesting this and suggesting that, and Bit put it together and sold it for £1. And I went round to the Bit office and bought the Asia Bit Guide, and that was the only information we really had, and it was a wonderful mishmash of information and misinformation. The guy who put it together, Jeff Crowther, for Bit at the time, later on became the star Lonely Planet writer. But we had the Bit Guide, we had various bits and pieces of information, and of course, most important is you met people along the way, and you quizzed them. You said, oh, you've come the opposite direction. Where did you stay at the place I'm going to be heading to tonight? So we gathered information as we went. And then when we were in Australia, so many people asked us, where did you go? How did you do it? What did it cost? And so on, that we thought, why don't we put a book together about it? And I think I did engineering at university, and I still have a little bit of an engineering interest and passion today, but I'd worked for a couple of years as an engineer and then never have as an engineer ever again. But the one really useful thing I did at university was work on the university newspaper. So I knew a little bit about journalism and how publications were put together and prepared for the printer and so on. So I knew how to do that element of it, and Maureen and I used to borrow her typewriter from office at the weekend and bring it home and work on it at home over the weekend and write it by hand in the week, and then at the weekend type it out again. And we put that first book together ourselves and found a little backstreet printer to get it printed, and I took a day off work and went around bookshops selling it, and amazingly it sold, and that was the start.
So talking about selling, how did you sell your first book?
Well, the first one, I remember before we even finished it, when we were still just thinking about it, I went into what at the time was the biggest bookshop in Sydney, and I went to their travel department, which was, the size of a kitchen table. It was hardly the sort of thing you have today, because there just weren't so many travel books. And I described to him what I was doing and said, I'm going to make this little book and I'm going to publish it myself because I haven't got time. We were setting off on another trip, so we didn't have, a year to talk with publishers and go back and forth with editors, putting things together. And we thought we'd do it faster ourselves. And I said, I'm going to do this book. It'll sell. It did sell eventually for $1.80. It was prices, as I say, prices have changed. $1.80 would be $18 or $25 or 20 quid or whatever today. Wow. It'd be a different ballgame. Described this to him, and he said, okay, that sounds interesting. If you do put it together and it's worth putting on the shelf, I will buy 50 copies, which was quite a lot. And so I went, when I actually had the book, I went straight to his bookshop and said, right, you told me a few months you buy 50 copies, here it is. And he said, okay, that looks good, I'll take 50. And followed on from that, I sold 10 here and 12 there. And at the end of the day, we thought, well, this is starting to work.
So were you the finance person, or was Maureen doing the finance?
Well, I would have to say, certainly for a few years, she was more the finance person, because like any business, it doesn't make money at first. And the first year that we were really working it, because when we did the first book, we both had full-time jobs. So it was a part-time job, and we had to sort of take a day's holiday to go and sell it around the bookshops and then fly down to Melbourne and sell it there. And then when we saw it was going, quit our jobs and set off right to New Zealand, first of all, to sell it there, and then set off travelling to do the second book. But then when we spent a year travelling doing our second guide to Southeast Asia, when we settled down again, she worked and her pay supported both of us, and I worked on the books and selling the books. So she was definitely the finance side of the business.
And when did you make that choice for you and Maureen to leave your jobs to do this full time?
Well, we did it our original plan when we left London was we are going to travel around the world in a year. And we thought, well, we'll spend six to 9 months getting to Australia. We'll work in Australia for 3 months. We'll save up enough money in that 3 months to fly back to England, or maybe stop in America for a couple of weeks or something. That 12 months after we left, we'd be back in London. And I in fact had a job. I had a job waiting for me. That when I graduated with my MBA, I got a job, and I said I didn't want to start immediately, and they said, we'll hold the job for you for 12 months. So I was going to go back to this job. But then by the time we got to Australia on that first hippie trail trip, we'd enjoyed ourselves so much. We'd had so much fun that the idea of just going straight back and getting into a 9-to-5 existence just didn't have any appeal anymore. So we thought, okay, we'll spend a year working in Australia. We'll do another 1-year trip. So we'll get back to London after 3 years instead of 12 months. And then we'll think about work. Then we'll think about getting jobs and settling down and all that. But then, of course, in that first year, we did the first book. And then the second year was devoted to doing the second book, and the idea of real work was off in the past and never returned.
So back then, could you get from Australia to London in one flight, or was it many flights?
Oh, of course, they were nowhere near as cheap as they are today. I mean, in dollar or pound terms, they were probably less than they are today, but as a percentage of your income or whatever, they were far more expensive. And I remember there was one of the cheap ways of getting to England from Australia, and I suppose vice versa, was you flew across Australia to Perth. You went on this weekly ship that went up to Singapore, and then you picked up a charter flight from Singapore to Gatwick, and that was the cheapest way to get from one to the other. Still at that time, some people were coming out to Australia by boat, not a cruise ship, but a regular passenger boat. So it wasn't like today when there are just heaps of flights and they go in one. Even when I did start flying back and forth, I remember at the time when, if you're looking back to that era, the late 60s and early 70s, say when the Beatles first went out to Australia in the late 60s, I think London to Australia was about 7 stops. You went something like London, Rome, Beirut, Delhi, Bangkok. You did multiple stops, because although the old 707s were just as fast as a modern A380 or whatever you fly on today, they didn't have anywhere near the range.
So airlines must love you, and you must have a lot of air miles, right?
Yeah, I do. I don't know whether they love me in some ways, I suppose, but they don't sort of see me coming and point me straight towards the sharp end of the aircraft. If I want to go to the sharp end, I pay for it myself.
And have you got lots of air miles?
I do, yeah, I do get them. I do use them as well. You don't want to waste the damn things.
Well, exactly. And I must ask, what's the last thing you stole from a hotel room?
The last thing I stole from a hotel room. I'm a person who believes in taking things to hotel rooms rather than selling them. I hate these little miniature bottles of shampoo and so on, which people wash their hair out of once, and then I presume the cleaners come through and throw them away. I sort of hope that hotel cleaners, never have to buy shampoo for themselves or their family.
Yeah.
But I have no idea what really happens to them. And I very often go away on a trip and I pick up the mini shampoo and conditioner bottle at the first hotel, and I then transport it for the next 10 hotels and leave the empty one in the last one. So I actually take things to hotels rather than steal them.
Great. So how do you, according to Google, you sold 150 million copies of The Lonely Planet?
Yeah, The Lonely Planet has, certainly a few years ago, we reached 100 million books, and we did various things to publicise that, and it's beyond 150 million now. And that, of course, it's just in the English language, because there are lots of Lonely Planet guides sold in other languages. And, of course, today, I've got nothing to do with Lonely Planet anymore. I sold out of it about 10 years ago, but it's doing fine without me. They don't need me. And, of course, a lot of their activity these days is not in print, or it's in print on screens rather than on paper.
And do you think that is the way the world's going for the Lonely Planet?
Yeah, it is, but it's not the only way. Books still there is still something about books, and a lot of people still do like reading books on paper. And I'm involved with another publishing house now, not a travel publisher, but a publisher that publishes fiction and non-fiction and a variety of things. And in the years I've been involved with that, we saw the sale of digital books you read on your tablet or your Kindle or whatever. We saw them growing and growing, and we thought, well, if you should never, of course, this is an elementary lesson that any entrepreneur learns, is never plot graphs, curves straight into the future. Things may go up and up and up, but they don't go up and up and up forever. And all sorts of companies have found that, and I'm sure that Google and Apple and Facebook and everybody else are going to find that, or are finding that as well, that things do bottom out or level out or go down. And the sales of digital books grew and grew and grew, and it got to about 30%, and then it sort of plateaued, and print books have come back. And although it's been sad how many bookshops we've seen disappear in recent years, the ones that are doing okay are doing okay. People still like them. They like the holding a book in their hands. They like going and hearing the author talk about it. There's all sorts of reasons why they continue.
So talking about those down moments, I'm sure you've had many along the way, but
Yeah.
What is the one or two things that really have?
I think anybody who goes into business themselves, it's always much more difficult in the early years. That there's that old joke about when you owe the bank £1,000 or 10,000 quid, or these days probably even 100,000 quid, and you can't pay it, you're in trouble. But when you owe the bank 10 million quid or 100 million quid, the bank is in trouble if you can't pay it back. So, that perspective changes. And I really remember in the early days when we got a little bit bigger and we had just a few employees, because for the first year or two, it was just Maureen and I, and then writers freelancing, and then we had one person working for us part-time, and then, we gradually took on more people. When we only had a handful of employees, and on Friday you had to pay them. And the one thing, you knew you had to do was pay your employees. You can't not pay them. They're right there, and they need the money of the weekend to pay their rent and buy food and things. And, if it got to Thursday night and we weren't sure we had enough money in the bank for the next day, we were really sweating it. And I remember that being if I've had something that has really worried me in business, it was that more than anything subsequently. Later on, when there were sort of financial problems, and of course there are from time to time, I'd turn to our accountant and I'd say, sort it out, and I knew he could.
And did you ever think about giving up, or were there days when you did think, this is it?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think in the early days when it was sort of hand to mouth and you weren't sure. I was sure it was going to work from the very start. I had a really good feeling about it. But certainly there were tough days, and a lot of that was tied up with money, and not enough of it came in. And I think so many businesses are suffering the thing, we sell things on 30-day terms, but the people we sell to don't pay on 30-day terms. They keep you waiting for 60, 90 or 120 or never pay. And, a lot of young people in business and entrepreneurs starting up new businesses really suffer through those elements of it. And, we were just like anybody else. And one of the things if I give credit for London Business School for anything. I had friends who had followed the standard path at London Business School and had come out and got the good jobs, and I'm driving around in a terrible old Ford Cortina and they're on their second company BMW. But the ones who I was friends with, sort of enjoyed hearing my tall tales and told me to persevere and didn't put any money into it, but did sort of give me the feeling that I was on the right course, path.
And you sold out to the Lonely Planet 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Reportedly £50 million, but there are different numbers out there. What are you doing now, and what was it like when that money was in the bank?
Well, one of the things we did with quite a lot of the money that we got from selling out was that we had a foundation in the business. The Lonely Planet Foundation, which we started up at the same. I've just watched the new Freddie Mercury film, and there's the Live Aid thing and the concert to raise money, and there's been the Bob Geldof and Bangladesh and all these things. And we at that time when there was the famine in Ethiopia, we thought, well, we're doing a lot of books on Africa and we're making money out of Africa. And we were a money-making company by this time. We should put some of the money back into the places that we write about. So we started the Lonely Planet Foundation, and we put a percentage of our income into that each year. And then as the income grew, it got bigger and bigger until we had this little department within the company, and an employee who looked after giving the company's money away. Well, when we sold the business, we couldn't say, oh, by the way, you've also bought this philanthropic foundation. So we effectively pulled it out of Lonely Planet. It actually operated out of the LP office for several years after we'd left LP. Lonely Planet liked it. But we put quite a lot of the money that we got from selling Lonely Planet into turning the Lonely Planet Foundation into the Planet Wheeler Foundation. And the same woman who used to run it at Lonely Planet, Anna Dumont, and my daughter Tashi, and a third person, Mark Hubert, the three of them run it, and it has about 70 projects in the developing world, principally in Southeast Asia and East Africa and increasingly West Africa. And it's really changing its focus more towards Africa these days, but generally quite small projects, although we also do work with the big people. MSF, for example, Human Rights Watch is another one that's quite big that we really like and work with. So, that was part of what we got into after we left Lonely Planet. I still do things for Lonely Planet. They ask me to write forwards for things or be on panels to judge competitions, and I'm still involved with Lonely Planet, although not in a sort of any formal way at all, but on a fairly regular basis. And I've always enjoyed the not in the English language side of Lonely Planet, and Lonely Planet's the biggest publisher of guidebooks in the Italian language, and EDT, Edizione di Torino, who published the LP guides in Italian, I'm very good friends with, and anytime they ask me to come to Italy and do some sort of promotion, I always say yes.
You're there.
I'm there, yeah. I was in Rimini this year with them. And, I like that. And the same with Lonely Planet's very strong in China these days. And I love working with them because, particularly young Chinese, it's very exciting to see the energy and enthusiasm there.
And is there one place you still haven't visited, which you need to go to?
There's lots of places I haven't visited, and I think every year, if I didn't have a few ticks in the been there box, I'd be disappointed. And I'm not. There are people who set out, and I know a few of them, to travel to every country on earth, or at least put a tick on all the boxes. And I haven't been doing that. But on the other hand, my list of countries I've been to gets a bit longer every year, and I'd be disappointed if there wasn't somewhere new. I've got lots of places. I'm going to Azerbaijan very soon, and principally because I haven't been there.
Amazing. And just two more questions before we finish. What does a typical day look like for you?
Oh, there isn't a typical day because it really depends what I'm doing, and I do travel quite a lot. I think to most people they would say you travel an awful lot compared to guidebook writers. I hardly travel at all, but I am on the road for months each year, so there's a fair amount of travel, and in which case every day is different from when you get up to when you go to bed. Other days, it's like a lot of other people. I get up and start looking at the list of emails I have to do, and I'm involved in. I've got small stakes in a few little companies that I'm involved with, and it's fun working with some of them, and I have lots of things that keep me busy.
And just to finish off, what is the one piece of advice you would give to Tony, age 20?
I think the thing, and I think it's the key advice to anybody, particularly people in some sort of setting up some sort of business, is do something you love. I mean, it's ridiculous not to do something you love. A, you won't like it, and B, the reason you'll convince people to buy your product or sign up with you or join you in your adventure is because they can see you love it. And if you love it, they're going to ride along in that enthusiasm.
Amazing. Well, Tony, thank you so much for your time. It's been a fascinating story, and safe travels.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.